Well, hi everybody, and welcome to SHOEphoria Episode 8, the podcast where myths are made and busted, especially in relation to running footwear. Thanks very much for tuning in on your podcast of favour. Please remember to like us, share us, comment, whatever you would like to do, and please also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and of course Facebook. Now, it's not very often that you get to interview someone who's a living legend. That's a term that's bandied around a bit, but this man absolutely epitomizes this particular term. He won his first Boston Marathon in 1968 when he was just 21 years old, and he has an incredible record in terms of running, both as an athlete and as a journalist who covered the sport over many years. He also has the distinction of returning to the Boston Marathon many years later, 46 years later, in 2013, and was at mile 25 when that terrible event, the terrorist bomb, went off during the Boston Marathon. He has absolutely fascinating insight into what it was like to be there at that time. He has the great distinction of having shared a room at university with his friends, the great marathon runner Bill Rogers, and also Jeff Galloway. And he tells me that at that time he was an ovolacto vegetarian and he was not at all involved in the sex, drugs and rock and roll of the 1960s. And that's maybe why he turned out to be such a great runner. Who knows? Anyway, it's a fascinating story. He's had a distinguished career in running. He's run the Comrades Marathon, the grueling South African marathon on not one but two occasions, both up and down. And he has an incredible record in the Manchester Road Race, which he has run 57 times annually, and he's won it 9 times. Apart from running, he has a very distinguished career as a sports journalist. And in fact, he was the executive editor of Runner's World from 1985 for almost 20 years. And during that time, I believe he elevated that magazine to its preeminent position. He wrote some of the finest articles on running you're ever likely to read, including in 1992, a piece entitled White Men Can't Run, which chronicled the rise of the great African runners and the dominance they held over the sport and do so to this day. He has particular insight into all sorts of different areas, including, of course, athletic footwear, running shoes in particular. And he has a few comments to make about what he sees as the state of play at the moment. I also asked him what was the best sporting performance he'd ever seen, and his answer certainly surprised me, and I think it will surprise you. So thanks very much for joining us on SHOEphoria. I'm Simon Bartold. I'm certain you will absolutely love this episode with Mr. Amby Burfoot. Thanks very much for joining us.
You're listening to the SHOEphoria podcast by Bartold Clinical. Listen in as we delve deep into the world of evidence-based sports science, sports medicine, and athletic footwear science. Let's go and bust some myths.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome to episode 8 of SHOEphoria, the podcast where running myths are made and busted. And I'm absolutely delighted to have with me today someone who can really truly be called a legend of the sport of running, Mr. Amby Burfoot. Amby, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, my time, this evening, your time. Thanks for being on the program.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, Simon, and let's just add living legend to what you just said, because I'm not quite ready to disappear.
They haven't named a memorial after you yet, mate, so that's always a good thing.
That's very good.
So Amby joins us from Mystic, Connecticut, and I must admit I was so intrigued by the name Mystic, Connecticut that was conjuring up all sorts of images for me that I had to Google it, and it looks like an absolutely beautiful place, Amby.
It's a very beautiful place. It's actually where I grew up, and so I am now in the fortunate or unfortunate position where I'm running many of the same road running training courses that I ran as a 20-year-old, and now it takes me twice as long to go the same distance. But it's a great place. It's very well known in the States for a movie that was named Mystic Pizza, and it's a little tourist town, but it's quite lovely to live here year-round.
Yeah, and another movie, Mystic River, I believe the Mystic River runs into the town.
We do have a Mystic River, and we were a whaling town of some repute in a certain day.
Yeah, really interesting. My wife was actually born in Bethel, Connecticut, so Connecticut's a pretty small state, so she's not too far away from you. So there you go, bit of a connection there. But listen, we're not here to talk about cities and where people were born. We're here to talk about you, and it is an incredibly interesting story, I think. So you began your running career back in the 60s, in the days when if you ran, well, you're certainly not running in very much shoe, and you were a very serious athlete indeed. So a different era, really, Amby, I guess.
Well, it was certainly a very, very different era, and none of us could ever have imagined where running has come and gone through and developed and evolved into. It would be nice to claim that I was smart enough in the mid-'60s to see this fantastic world sport that has developed, but it would be an utter, complete lie, and I don't think any of us in the 60s saw what was coming.
Yeah, no, it's certainly a changed sport, and just the popularity of the sport is interesting. But I was very fascinated to read, so I've done a bit of homework on you, mate, so I've been in touch with the CIA to make sure I've got all the dossier correct. But you're part of a very interesting lineage stretching from John Kelly the Elder to John Kelly the Junior, who was your high school coach. And then, of course, you roomed with a bloke who was a pretty handy runner himself by the name of Bill Rogers. And you all won the Boston Marathon, if I'm not incorrect.
Well, I guess that is correct, certainly, and it's a New England lineage and a Connecticut lineage with John J. Kelly, myself, and Bill Rogers. And, you know, there's actually one other person who intersects very largely in the loop, and that is my other college roommate at Wesleyan, who was not named Bill Rogers, was someone named Jeff Galloway. And Jeff didn't win the Boston Marathon, but he did make it to the Olympics, and he himself has had a very, very profound impact on the evolution of running as we know it.
Absolutely. There are some really big names in running there, and Jeff is somebody I might need to try to get onto the show at some point in time. I really need to speak to these guys to find out what sort of roommate you were.
I was the roommate who went to bed at 9 o'clock every night, got up at 6 a.m. and ran my 6 or 8 miles for the first day's workout, ran again in the afternoon. The best joke I tell about my college days is that I went to college in the U.S. in the 1960s, reputed to be an era of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and I didn't do any of that stuff. But I did a lot of running.
Yeah, and what you did do in 1968 is win the Boston Marathon, which is a pretty amazing thing. So maybe the days of abstinence paid off, but tell us a little bit about that experience.
Well, I won Boston when I was 21 years old, and, you know, that's ridiculously too young to be winning something like the Boston Marathon, and I suppose you can't really appreciate it at that age. I would like to say that I did appreciate it a substantial amount because I was running, after I met John J. Kelly, my high school coach, I was running every day and week and month in his image. He was the smartest and most inspirational person I've ever met, in addition to being a Boston Marathon winner and a 2-time Olympic marathoner. He was so forward-thinking. I tell people in the 1950s, when people didn't even know what environmentalism is, he was riding his bicycle to work rather than polluting the environment with his car. He had an organic garden and a compost heap in the 1950s, and nobody knew what organic gardening or composting was in the 1950s, but he did, and he was practicing it. He was a literature lover, a scholar, an Irish yarn teller, and a complete inspiration in every way. So I just sort of mimicked everything he did in his life and tried to become a Boston Marathon winner myself, and was incredibly lucky in 1968 when it actually happened.
Yeah, it sounds like he was an incredible mentor and, as you say, quite inspirational. And I understand that at that time you were a vegetarian, which must have been quite unusual for the day. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe that was really mostly for ethical reasons rather than anything else. So I guess that John J. Kelly had some say in that as well.
He was an ovolacto vegetarian, and that's what I became. And at the time, I certainly said I was a vegetarian for ethical reasons. And I remained a strict ovolacto vegetarian for about 15 years until I had kids. And of course, they only wanted to eat junk food, and I couldn't stand to see the food wasted when they were finished, so I would eat a little bit of their fried chicken and things like that. But I've remained 99% vegetarian my whole life. These days, I think a lot of people eat salmon and other healthy fish because of all the research we've read. And I will occasionally these days even sink into a hamburger to try and get an extra little protein in my doting old age. But my diet's pretty healthy, and it's certainly very, very highly plant and vegetable based.
Yeah, well, you're in pretty good company there. I can think of a couple of blokes who are looking very good into their 70s, you being one and Paul McCartney being the other. And of course, Paul McCartney is a lifetime vegetarian as well. So there must be something in it. Maybe, well, I eat pretty healthy. I must admit, I don't eat any junk, but I do enjoy sinking my teeth into a good steak occasionally. Now, Amby, so you had a really good year in 1968. So you also won the Fukaoka Marathon in your best time of 2:14:29 that same year. So that was a pretty nice year for you.
It was a sensational year, but for me personally and running, but I do have to correct you. At Fukuoka, I was fifth. It was Fukuoka, even back then, was a very, very exceptional race. The great British marathoner Bill Adcox ran 2:10:30. Give or take a few seconds in a wonderful negative split race. And I simply ran 5-minute pace as long as I could and faded a little bit towards the end. But I've always joked, God bless the Japanese for their timing accuracy, because they gave me a time of 2:14:28.8. Nobody told me that the American record at the time was 2:14:28.0. So if somebody had only egged me on a little bit, I could have maybe gotten into the American record books with a kick at the finish. But I was extraordinarily happy to run that fast in a big international race like Fukuoka.
Yeah, it's a very famous race, and to be 1 second off the American record, that's pretty close. So that was a terrific run. But one of the things that fascinates me with my heritage in sports medicine is that looking at these times, and obviously that was an Olympic year, you should have been running in the Olympic trials, I'm guessing, and having a shot at the Olympics. But I understand that you dabbled in steeplechasing and you had an injury that prevented you from getting to the Olympic trials.
Well, in 1968, as you say, it was an Olympic year, and every right-thinking runner in the world skipped all the races they could in order to peak for their Olympic trials or whatever it took to get them qualified for the Olympics. But I was too much of a romantic for that, in the sense that the Boston Marathon was just as important to me because of the Kelly heritage as the Olympic trials and the Olympics were. So I went ahead and ran Boston in a year when I should have been resting for the trials, and I'm certainly glad I did. I would never give back that race for anything. And then a month after Boston, I was running what I thought would be the last track competition of my life, because track led to nowhere in those days, unless you happen to be Jim Ryan or someone like that. And I was certainly not a great track runner. So in the last track championships of my life, a small college championships though it was, there was a steeplechase. And I thought, the steeplechase is kind of like Mount Everest. I got to have one go at it in my life, and this is my last chance. So I'll run the steeplechase. And on that particular day, I won the 3-mile, the open 3-mile first, and sat in the grass for an hour, and then they called out the steeplechasers, and I lined up with the steeplechasers. I didn't know what I was doing, so I followed everyone around the track for 2 laps, and then I thought to myself, well, this is insanely slow. What are these guys doing? So the 3rd lap, I circled the field and went into the lead, and I won the silly little steeplechase race in, something like 8:48, which was great. It gave me 2 victories for the day in my last track competition of my life. And the next day, when I tried to get out of bed, I literally couldn't lift my one leg, the hurdling leg, out of bed, because I had pretty much torn a big muscle back in the glutes or something. And so I had a long injury. I didn't deal well with it. I didn't give it time to rest. And as a result, 2 months later, when I was at the Olympic marathon trials, I was still injured, and I dropped out of the race at 15 miles.
Yeah, so that's a fascinating story at a number of levels. First of all, I love the fact that you almost prioritized the Boston Marathon and, of course, won it, and that's in the history books. But what you just described there is probably the reason why most of us sports medicine clinicians tear our hair out with our athletes who go out and do dumb things, get injured, don't spend the time rehabbing it properly, and then go and do it all again. So you're a copybook there.
I certainly did. And when I give talks at marathon clinics and things, I have an expression that you'll appreciate. And that expression is the first smart runner hasn't been born yet, which is to say we all repeat the mistakes of those who came before us, because when you're going good, no matter what, you just think you're going to keep going good forever. We all have this little sense of invincibility, and when things are good, we can't believe that they're going to turn bad. And so we do stupid things, and if you or anyone else can ever figure out how to invent the first smart runner, that would be a very great contribution.
Well, it's not just runners. I've got a great mate in the UK who's an ex-Olympian, and he's also a podiatrist, and he recently was feeling so good, he pretty much doubled his workload and, of course, got injured. So, it's an issue for everybody. So Boston 1968, and what I want to do is fast forward to what might be a bit of a painful memory for you 46 years later in 2013, one of the most terrible things to happen in sport, really, the Boston Marathon, and you were there running that race. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like, Amby?
Yes, of course I can, and I'll try not to go on forever. The memories for those of us who were there are intense and many. So 2013 was the 45th anniversary of the year I had won Boston in 1968, and at that point I was running Boston every fifth year. So there I was in 2013, and I kind of thought I was the big man on campus because I was the only returning 45-year-old champion at Boston. And even though I was running at a pace of 4 hours and 15 minutes or whatever, I was still out there. And so I was running with a couple of friends, and we got to the 25-mile mark, and suddenly we're just stopped. This has never happened to me before in a road race. There's just a cordon of people stopped, like 1,000 runners stopped, milling around in front of me. Up ahead of them are a few police or officials. And, frankly, I'm pissed off. I'm a mile from finishing, so I know I'm going to make it. And, what is stopping me from having my glorious 45th anniversary run? And unbelievably enough, because of the buildings and the distance a mile away, we had absolutely no inkling of a clue what had happened at the finish line. And I didn't know what it was. I was asking other runners. They didn't know. And suddenly, my cell phone rang. It was practically, I think it was the only race in my life where I brought my cell phone. And it was my wife on the other line. She was near the finish waiting for us. And she said to me, Amby, whatever you do, do not finish this race. Get back to the hotel and stay there. And there was such an urgency in her voice that, as I often say, it was one of the few times in my life I've actually listened to my wife and did what she said. And we walked back to the hotel, and there were armed guards in the lobby. And as we walked, we heard the sirens and the first responders. And slowly it dawned on me that I was not the biggest, most important event in Boston that day, that in fact a horrible tragedy had just occurred. And I was lucky that I was not part of that tragedy, lucky that I was stopped and sent home by my wife and the police forces. And from that point on, we just watched on TV, as the whole world watched on TV over the next 3 or 4 days, to see what would happen. And what was interesting, Simon, was immediately after the bombings, for hours, probably a couple of days, we all thought, oh my God, is this the end of running? Is this the end of the Boston Marathon? Runners will surely be afraid of gathering in public again to run Boston. Spectators will be afraid of crowding the sidewalks and cheering for the Boston Marathon runners. And then suddenly, after 2 days, we all kind of got over the first chilling thoughts, and we realized that no, in fact, we all wanted to run the Boston Marathon the next year because we wanted to reclaim the great race, the great traditions, the roads from Hopkinton to Boston. We wanted to be there to begin the great tradition again. And of course, the spectators wanted to be out there cheering for us in numbers as they had never cheered before. And so from tragedy came brilliance of the 2014 Boston Marathon, which I am absolutely positive for the rest of history will be the greatest marathon event ever held on this earth, because it was glorious beyond any words or ability to describe it. And those of us fortunate enough to be running it that day, and they increased the field to about 36,000. We realized while we were out there that we were so privileged to be part of this magnificent event being reborn.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I mean, watching from afar, obviously Adelaide is a long way from Boston, but the whole Boston Strong movement, was something pretty special for us all to watch. And the Boston Marathon is the great marathon. It's the most famous and best in the world. And, the qualification process is pretty stringent. And so I think, if I understand correctly, you've now run every Boston Marathon since 2013. Is that right?
Always my goal was to get to 2018, which would be the 50th anniversary of my win at Boston in 68. So my plan had been to run in 2013 and then rest up for 5 years and then run 2018. But of course, as I said, we all wanted to return the next year. And so I returned and ran in 2014. And at that point, I said, what the heck? I've done 2 years in a row. I might as well do 6 or whatever it'll take to get up to 2018. So now I'm spending all my time. You can see that I have visions of limelight when I run. I'm spending all my time envisioning this glorious race that I'm going to have in 2018 when I will be the third person actually in Boston history to finish the race 50 years after winning. And I'm imagining sunshine and Hollywood and plaudits and gloriousness. And what descends is the worst weather in the history of the Boston Marathon. You had to endure it in 2018 to really appreciate how terrible it was. And many of us were very close to hypothermia the whole way. And that really scared me because to become hypothermic, you really could not finish the race. And my goal was to finish. I didn't care how long it would take me. It wasn't a race for time. Fortunately, I dressed well enough, just barely, so I stayed about a degree ahead of hypothermia and was able to finish.
Yeah, it was an amazing race. I watched it on TV and I had to rug up at home watching it on telly. It was so cold. But one of the other interesting athletic achievements for you, Amby, is the Manchester Road Race, which you've run, I believe, 57 times consecutively, and you've won it 9 times. Now, that's a pretty fair effort.
Yeah, I tell people that Manchester is truly my greatest achievement in running because I think the endurance of going back and completing the race year after year after year is something that speaks powerfully to all distance runners and marathoners. It's what we want to do, after all, to stay out there as long as possible, and to have a long racing streak proves that you've done it. I often tell people that winning the Boston Marathon is easy. You only have to have a modest amount of talent and train your ass off for 3 or 4 years and then have a good day. But to finish an annual race like Manchester 57 years in a row has nothing to do with talent and nothing to do with having good days, because in 57 years you have plenty of bad days. And I've had my bad days during the Manchester Road Race, but one way or another, I've gotten myself around the route and finished the course. And that's one that I will keep going as long as I possibly can. I won't go to the point of a doddering walk, but as long as I can run the race at a pace which is kind of appropriate for my age, 70s, 80s, whatever it might be, I will keep going to that one.
Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic. I think it's an incredible achievement. Now, I've just got so many things I want to talk to you about, but I do want to talk to you about your other career, apart from athletics, and that, of course, is as a journalist. And you took over as executive editor of Runner's World when Rodell brought it over to the East Coast. And you held that position, I think, for almost 20 years. And you really defined the magazine as far as I'm concerned. You were the guy who actually brought that magazine into prominence. And without blowing up too much, Amby, I've always had great admiration for the way you've written. You've just covered so many topics and navigated quite a few storms in running with a great degree of diplomacy and accuracy. And I think your understanding of lots of different aspects of running, the physiology and the biomechanics, is quite extraordinary. That something that we don't see in very many journalists. The only other one I can think of who's a scientist is probably Alex Hutchinson. But tell us a little bit about that era where Runner's World really did start to hit its straps.
Well, thank you very much for the kind words, Simon. And I agree with you. Alex Hutchinson, who's a good friend, is without equal in his journalistic covering of the science of running for the wider media, for the non-PhD crowd, who is most of us, unlike some of you. But I have never taken any credit for the growth and influence of Runner's World. I've always given that credit to the readership, who I believe is itself incredibly intelligent and incredibly dedicated to healthy living through running for the most part. And the readers of the magazine are just so sensational and smart and disciplined and curious that they go along with almost anything we give them, as long as we try and give it a serious take. So really, for me as editor at Runner's World, what I wanted to do was edit a magazine that reached as many people as it could possibly reach while remaining true to the essential basic nature of the sport, which is, it's not Wimbledon. Sometimes, sadly, it's not the Masters golf. Sometimes, sadly, it is what it is. It has grown to a tremendous status around the world with incredible international marathons and track races around the world. It's a true global sport, but it's not one that we see on television every weekend by any means. So the things that changed in running in my years and continue to change, first is age group or masters runners. When I first started, there was only old John Kelly, and he was probably 50 then, and we thought he was the oldest person on earth who was still moving. And there were literally in my first years at the Boston Marathon, no women competitors. And now, of course, as we all know, women are half the sport, if not more. They have made the sport entire and whole and better than it ever was without them. For better or worse, they are beacons to the family and to health as an important part of the sport, as well as just fast speed, setting records. And so I'm very proud of the fact that in my tenure at Runner's World, we jumped on the women's running bandwagon early and hard and supported them as much as we possibly could, supported efforts to get the marathon and the other distance events into the Olympics, and just in general supported the notion that women were an important missing part of running, and we needed to do everything we possibly could to include them.
Yeah, well, that alone's a fantastic achievement, and I think you were actually commentating at the Olympics when Joan Benoit came in, quite surprisingly, into the Olympic Stadium and crossed the line first. So the first woman to win the Olympic marathon, and you were there calling it.
Wait a minute, Simon. You said surprisingly. We Americans all knew Joan was going to win. And I wasn't commentating. I was writing at the Olympics in Los Angeles. And believe me, we all had a tear in our eyes when she came in. We would have had a tear for Ingrid or Greta or Rosa or anyone else, but for Joni in an American Olympics in Los Angeles, it was very spectacular.
Yeah, a little bit like us when Kathy Freeman managed to pull off the 400 metres in Sydney. I've seen a lot of great sporting moments, but that's certainly right up there with them. So
I don't know about you, but I was in the stadium that night, and of course, there's never been a night like it. It was unbelievable.
I was on the track at the start-finish line.
Oh, that's even better.
Absolutely. I was working there and I had what they call an infinity pass, so I could go anywhere I wanted, and it was absolutely unbelievable. That night it was an incredible night at track and field. Yeah. So you've mentioned that Runner's World had a big part in women being included in the sport, which has just been so incredibly important. And as you said, they're now more than 50% of the sport. But in 1992, you wrote what I consider to be one of the most influential articles on running, and that was entitled White Men Can't Run. And it was a commentary on the emergence and the elevation of the African runners, or runners of African descent. Well, I guess we're all of African descent, but you know what I'm talking about. So that was a pretty important article, and it kind of chronicled the domination of particularly distance running by African runners. Do you want to just talk us through that a little bit?
Yes, Simon, and thank you for remembering that. I spent a lot of time, years on that article. It was very, very much an evidence-based article with athletic statistics and interviews with some of the leading scientists, including geneticists of sport, in that age. One of the things that's interesting in retrospect is that the people who were studying the genetics of running, let's call it, at that era, were very convinced that they were only 2 or 3 years away from solving the issue and having an absolute answer for the East and West African domination in various parts of the track world. As we know, that hasn't come to pass. And the questions remain out there, and people are still looking for answers and have come to recognize that it's ever so much complex than anyone imagined 30 years ago. But it was a controversial article. I had to do a lot of discussion with other people at Runner's World, including the publisher, to make sure they were behind it. And when I showed them what I had written and they could see that it was not a racial diatribe, but in fact an evidence-based article that did, in fact, describe something happening before our eyes in track. I mean, you can't deny it if you're watching track meets. Then everyone supported the article and got behind it. And I must say I was not the first person to point out this phenomenon, but I was quite proud of the job I did with it.
Yeah, no, I think it's quite a landmark article, and for anybody listening, if you can track it down, you should read it. It's a terrific read. Amby, you've been quite prolific. You've written 6 books and you've seen a lot of things come and go. I can't, just because it's such an interesting point for me, and I think I read every single thing that was written from about 2009 to about 2013, when we were in the midst of the barefoot running storm. And one of the people who charted those stormy waters so well was you. You've got interesting heritage there, because I do know that you ran with some barefoot runners like Doc Robbins, and I'd just be interested in a snapshot of your thoughts on that quite turbulent era. I mean, became very polarizing, didn't it? You're either with them or against them, basically, and there was no middle ground. So what did you see at that time?
Yeah, it was very interesting. And, I knew Chris McDougall at the time, and at some point I loaned him a bunch of books about the Tarahumaras and some other things that he used for some research. And at some point we all heard this story that he had gotten a very significant amount of big advance for a writer to do this story about the Tarahumaras. And I said to him, Chris, what's going on? Why is New York Publishing paying money for a book about the Tarahumaras? Is it going to be called the Tarahumara Diet Secret or something? And he said, no, they're just interested in, this interesting tribe in Mexico. And I was like, that's crap. Nobody's that interested in the Tarahumaras to give you a bunch of money to write a book. I'm not sure if Chris knew at that point that the book was going to end up being about barefoot running. I'm not sure. I would love to know who it was, Chris or someone at Publishing House, who turned the promotion of the book, which was about the Tarahumaras and a lot of other things, but the promotion turned entirely into the barefoot running phenomenon. And of course, the flip side of it, which got them publicity in every single newspaper in the world, was, are your running shoes causing your injuries? And Chris was there to say, yes, they are. And this was man bites dog. It was the exact opposite of conventional wisdom, and it guaranteed them worldwide coverage, and so it was absolutely brilliant. My take on barefoot running was always very simple. I ran barefoot when I was young. If I was on a golf course doing a great fartlek workout, I ran barefoot once or twice in 2-mile races on a new all-weather track, which didn't hurt my feet at all. But there was no way I was going to run barefoot on the roads where I did my everyday training and my racing, because it just hurt too damn much. There was no way of doing that well and fast that I could see, and there was real injury, and there were other threats. There are nails and broken glass, all sorts of crap. I was on our public radio once with Chris in an interview, and we were just going back and forth, and he said to the interviewer, no one running barefoot will ever get injured. And I was, without even thinking, I just said, Chris, that's the biggest pile of crap I've ever heard anyone say about running. Of course someone will get injured running barefoot. And not only did someone, but apparently many people did. It was a crazy time. The size of the movement, the success of certain shoes seemed kind of crazy. I suppose it was inevitable that we would go from there to super thick plush shoes that were the exact opposite. And then everyone would start reporting that these big thick plush shoes helped them get back to running after having been injured. And then the next most startling thing, and this was the bigger surprise to me, was the success of the Nike Vaporfly shoes. I was absolutely 100% certain that no one could produce a running shoe that was any faster than the slightest running shoe with maybe a very modest midsole, but it had to be light. And I was at the 26 U.S. Olympic Marathon trials, which was the debut of the Vaporflies, and I'm standing there watching Galen Rupp warm up for the race in a thick pair of training shoes. And I'm thinking to myself, damn, this Galen Rupp is confident. He thinks he can make the Olympic team in a thick, cushioned pair of training shoes. Well, little did I know, little did any of us know at the time, but that has been a really revolutionary story, of course, as well.
Yeah, it's the old statement, isn't it, mate? You can't beat science. I mean, I'm just absolutely staggered by what Nike have achieved, and I know some of the people who've been involved in the project, and, you know, these are very deep thinkers and very good scientists, and I think people probably don't understand just exactly what goes into developing a project like that. And of course, it's not just the shoe. I mean, you look at the athletes and you look at the training they do and the way they're managed, from nutrition to hydration to sleep, and, you know, even looking at the Ineos Challenge where they chose a site that was only 3-hour time difference between Kenya, where Elliot lives and trains, to Vienna. But yeah, it's pretty interesting. And I was going to ask you a little bit about that. We've talked a lot about the Vaporfly project on this podcast, so I don't really want to labor that. But I do appreciate your comments about barefoot running, and the perfect storm really with Dan Lieberman's paper as well, hitting the press about the same time as Chris McDougall, I think gave it a big leg up. But my comment would be that I think a lot of people don't actually understand, because the discussion became so polarized, they don't understand that there is a definite benefit to training in either a lot less shoe or training barefoot. And it's always been there. It's always been in the sport, and it's always been a part of quality coaching, I think. So if you understand it properly, you can exploit it properly. And it's not a, is it right or is it wrong? It's when and how do you use it, basically. And I think that was the discussion that got lost in all the enthusiasm for something different. But we came out the other end stronger, I think.
Of course. I mean, it makes sense to me that, you know, we're all brought up wearing shoes from day one, and that's probably not the best way to develop intrinsic muscles in our feet. And probably good development of those muscles can add to performance, because at the top, everybody's looking not for 4%. Everybody would settle for 1/10 or 0.2%. So the right amount of barefoot running makes complete sense to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that number 4%, if people have not really done the sum, so 4% over a marathon, we're talking about a 4% energetic advantage, is absolutely huge. So you've done a bit of running in your time, Amby, and you've done a lot of different things, and you have run Comrades a couple of times, is that right?
Yes, I've run Comrades both up and down, because, come on, if you haven't done the up race, it doesn't count. So I've run it twice.
Well, I got to tell you, I've actually done Comrades as well, but I did it in a motor car, and I was exhausted at the end of it. So for those of you who don't know, I think it's 70 Ks, isn't it, Amby? Is that right? 70 kilometres?
That sounds right.
Yeah, and it's absolutely brutal. So it is big uphills and big downhills, and it's anybody who runs Comrades is a very, very accomplished and very tough runner. So, look, I really appreciate your time. I'm going to finish off with just one question. I put you on the spot here because you've seen so much and you've commented so much on it. What, for you, what's the greatest athletic performance you've seen?
Well, it's very hard to vote against Eliud Kipchoge, whose every performance is just astonishing these days, whether pace, whether wearing shoes, whether with special drinks or anything. Let me just think for a moment if anything else comes up besides Eliud, who's top of mind for everyone. I will go to the other extreme and say something quite different. In 1994, by chance, I happened to run the marathon that Oprah Winfrey ran. And Oprah Winfrey, you know, had gone through a couple of years of losing 100 pounds and trying to get in shape. And she shows up by surprise at this marathon. But there are 10,000 other runners in the race, and every single one of them knows who she is. And every single one of them comes up on her in the race, claps her on the back, says a few words like, "Oprah, I'm so glad you're out here. You're an inspiration, you know. good luck to you. You're helping the world every single day. And in the early miles, she's actually turning around and acknowledging the people and trying to say something kindly back to them. But of course, by the time she hits the 20-mile mark, she hasn't got an ounce of energy to turn or make eye contact or anything. They're still coming and they're still slapping her on the back. And she plodded through that thing in a really reasonable time, like 4 hours and 29 minutes, and sped up a little bit in the last mile, which was uphill on that course. And it was definitely the most courageous up-close marathon I've ever seen under the most duress, because nobody would stop bothering her during the race. They were all well-intentioned, but damn it, it's a bother when people are doing that to you when you're trying to focus on your own race. So I really give her credit for what she achieved that day.
Yeah, I didn't realize it was that long ago. That was New York, right?
No, that was Marine Corps in Washington, D.C. in 94, I believe.
Right, yeah, that was a long time ago. Yeah,
Yes.
well, look, I watched a fantastic movie the other day called Eddie the Eagle about Eddie Edwards, who was the British ski jumper, and it was a fascinating story because all he ever wanted to do was get to the Olympics, and he didn't care what sport it was or how he did it. But he had polio. He had polio as a kid, and yeah, it was a very inspirational story, actually, and really good watch. But I think there are two that stand out for me. One was Ben Johnson in Seoul, which was such a disappointment in the end, but I'm not sure I'll ever see a better 100 metres run. And, of course, Elliot, which I watched from start to finish in Vienna, was just, extraordinary. And for me, being a shoe guy, I had all these things swirling through my mind about how could he be so fresh at the end of the race? Does the shoe, is it fatigue reducing? Is there some different effect other than just the economic benefit of the shoe? So, yeah, it was a fabulous race. It was terrific.
Simon, if you've got time for 2 more minutes, I'll tell you an Elliot story you don't know, which is another part of his success.
Plenty of time.
Okay. Runner's World is on a trip to Kenya with a group of about 20 people, and I won't get the year right, about 2005 or so. We're high up on the Rift. We're just a bunch of slow white runners. One day we go to visit the training camp that Elliot was at then and has been at ever since. My wife wants to run that day. She's even slower than the rest of us. And so we need someone to run with us. I raise my hand to the group of Kenyan runners and I say, would any of you be willing to run 12-minute pace with my wife and myself for 5K? And I swear to God, Eliud Kipchoge raises his hand with that big smile on his face, steps forward, and everyone else takes off into the distance, and Eliud runs 12 minutes per mile pace with my wife and I for 5K, chatting the whole way, as relaxed as could be. There's not a part of his psyche that doesn't understand that it's okay at times to be relaxed and take life easy, so that at those times when you want to run 159, you can be fully primed to run 159.
Yeah, I mean, he just seems like a lovely bloke, and everything I've read about him and the interviews I've heard with him, he just seems completely without ego, and he's just a runner. And yeah, I hope I can meet him one day. I'm not sure I ever will, but that's a fantastic story. What a great experience to be able to say that you've run with Eliud Kipchoge.
I only wish we had the video, but we don't.
Okay, well, look, I'm aware that it's getting late there in Mystic, so I will wrap it up now, but I just want to say a big thank you. That's just been a fantastic insight into you and your career. It's been, as I said, a wonderful career, and so glad that I was able to chat with you. The last time we met was high up in the Hearst Tower in New York City in 2018, I think. So hopefully we'll catch up face-to-face at some stage in the future once we've dealt with this bug that's floating around the globe. And yeah, I just want to say a big thank you to you, Amby. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, Simon, thank you for the call and the conversation, which has been great fun, and also for all your contributions to the sport.
Thank you so much for that, and we'll meet again sometime, hopefully in the very near future.
You bet.
Thanks for joining us for the SHOEphoria podcast by Bartold Clinical. Join us next time.